This is going to be a very exciting week, both inside Raid Shadow Legends, of course, as well as for the channel, so make sure to stay tuned. There's actually going to be a double upload going out today, and then I do actually have a collab coming on Wednesday as well, with a fairly well-known Raid YouTuber, so I'm excited to be bringing that forward. I don't want to spoil too much about it, but it'll be going up Wednesday morning. Make sure to tune in for that. We have some events going on inside Raid currently, so we do have the Asgardian Deck of Fate, where we can actually get ourselves Freya for free as a guaranteed champion, essentially with a bunch of summoning soul stones as well as upgrading champions. Now, champion training certainly isn't too bad, but the summoning soul stones is how you're going to get the most of your points, and let's just say you don't get too many points in general. So it is nice, though. We do have the reset coming through on the city of Centranos currently, meaning that we can get ourselves into Dark Fae and get some extra coins and stuff there that will help out with this, of course, so that's going to be quite nice. And then as well, if you've been farming your Iron Twins, you're probably going to have a decent amount of Soul Stones. Let me know down below if you guys are going for Freya. I certainly am. As you can see, I'm probably just over halfway done the event currently, but I have sunk basically all my points so far into champion training, and I don't have a whole lot more that I can push, so I'm really hoping to, get some soul stones in the next coming days here. We do have, of course, the Hydra reset coming too, which will give us a little bit more, so I did time the event pretty well. We still have almost 4 days, 3.5 days roughly to get this done, so we certainly have time. That being said, though, we're going to be talking about some interesting subject matter here today. So I am actually going to go ahead and throw a screenshot on video here now for you to check out. This video idea was actually suggested by a viewer on my last video that I put out. My last video was talking about essentially epic variants or epic versions of legendary champions. So for example, using a Gorgorab instead of an Arbiter and things like that. And they actually raised the interesting point that I should do it the other way around too. So viewing the epic version of rares. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing. We're going to be talking about some champions that you might have early on in the game, or that you might be using fairly early on in your career, and we're going to be talking about some epic alternatives or upgrades to them. And keep in mind, even if you don't have these specific champions, whether it be the rare or the epics, just take the ideas into consideration, because there's rarely ever one single champion in the game that does the same thing. So let's go ahead and hop into it. What we're going to be talking about first is War Maiden. So War Maiden is kind of the rare that everybody starts off with, because she has an AoE defense break. She has a extra hit if it's critical, as well as an increased attack on her A2, and she does have a poison on her A1. And not only that, she is actually campaign farmable as well, so you can essentially fully book her. You can fully farm her just by farming the campaign, which is very nice. And as you can see from the reviews, people are quite high on her. Now, back in the day, probably a couple months ago, I actually made a video on a champion that I think is slightly better, but doesn't really get talked about. Not many people viewed this video, so not many of you might have seen the call out, but that's actually going to be Fencer. Why is Fencer better? Well, her A1 has a decreased speed on the enemy, so that's each hit having a 30% chance of placing it on a 2x hitter. Her A2 attacks one enemy, 75% chance of a stun. If it's not placed, she's just going to steal 20% of the target's turn meter instead. So with the decreased speed double hitter, as well as the stealing of turn meter, you can really see how she's automatically more useful for something like Fire Knight, of course, right? Because War Maiden doesn't bring that in her kit. And then she does also have an AoE defense break on a 3-turn cooldown. Now, the downside to this is it is the small version of a decreased defense. And you'll also see that this is the small version of a decreased speed. Well, that is perfectly fine, because as things are today, we do actually have blessings now that can help us out a little bit. So if we come over to Harmony and then Nature's Bounty, this is essentially going to have a chance of placing the big version of a debuff when you place that particular debuff. So instead of the decreased defense being the 30%, it'll have a chance of placing the 60%, and that chance is going to depend based on the awakening level on your champion, but at a very base level, you're still getting a 15% chance to place that bigger version of a debuff, which is quite intense. So again, there's going to be a little bit more RNG introduced, but I do think Fencer is a fantastic champion that can fill most of the same roles as a War Maiden, if not a little bit better in my somewhat professional opinion. Another champion that we're going to talk about that you can use actually instead is going to be Mist Rider Daithi. Everybody knows Daithi at this point. I do believe Saf is fairly high on this guy. He is absolutely fantastic. A1, 50% chance, books to a 60% chance of removing a buff. Also has a 20% chance of granting this champion an extra turn. Now this is very, very decent because he can help to cycle turns, as you'll see in the rest of his kit. Removing that buff is also going to allow you to run him in Fire Knight and not have to worry about those annoying unkillables or block damages getting placed, and then you just keep pushing back their turn meter. We've all had it where you leave it farm overnight and you come back and you're like one run in because you got bad RNG, right? So that buff removal is quite nice. AoE defense break on the A2 on a 4-turn cooldown, so it's a 100% chance, but he does get an extra turn if it's placed on all enemies by this skill, which is pretty fantastic. And in A3, the big money, increase attack and increase accuracy on him for 3 turns on a 4-turn cooldown and grants an extra turn. So this guy has an extra turn mechanic on his A3. He comes in, places a defense break. He gets an extra turn if everybody gets it. Then he also has a chance of an extra turn on his A1. He also has an ally accuracy in all battles by 40. Very decent base stats on Mist Rider as well. This guy is absolutely fantastic. Highly recommend him. And he can actually do some very, very decent damage as well. The next champion we're talking about that you can potentially use instead of War Maiden is actually going to be Ursala, another champion that I am quite fond of. I've made a video on her at this point as well. She has a triple hitter A1. Each critical hit has a 100% chance of stealing 5% of the target's turn meter, so essentially all together, if she's critting, it's a 15% turn meter steal. She has an A2, which is attacks one enemy 3 times, each hit having a 75% chance of placing a decreased defense, weaken, and decrease speed. So what's incredibly strong about this is it's a 3 times hitter, meaning even if you're going against a strong affinity champion, there's a very solid chance that you're going to get these debuffs placed. And she does have the 3 essential debuffs that you need to do more damage and take more turns, especially against something like Fire Knight. So setting up your team absolutely perfectly. And then her A3 fills everybody's turn meter and places an increased crit rate on everybody for 2 turns on a 3-turn cooldown. This champion is absolutely sensational. She has ridiculously good base speed at 112. Ursala is quickly becoming one of my favorite champions in the game. She's just so incredibly useful, and she can actually hit very hard as well, especially if you have her in something like, Phantom Touch or something like that, where she's getting the extra hits off along with her triple hitting A1. Lastly, the next champion you could look at as an upgrade, of course, to War Maiden is going to be Deacon Armstrong. So Deacon Armstrong has an A3, fills everybody's turn meter by 15, decreases the enemies by 15, and grants an extra turn. Then he comes into an AoE defense break, and his A1 is a 2 times hitter, having a leech on his A1 as well, which will help with your survivability. This guy is absolutely fantastic basically everywhere inside the game, and he is actually all but essential for a lot of clan boss compositions as well. That being said, though, these days if you have Wixwell, you're basically set on clan boss. That's all you have to really worry about is just Wixwell, and you're done. Now, next up, we're going to be talking about replacing your starter champions and just some options that you can think about. So it is going to depend a little bit on who your starter champion is. That being said, though, if you have one of the damage-dealing starter champions, so for example an Aethel, an Elhain, or a Gaelic, if you picked Gaelic, a nice little alternative and an upgrade that you can look at that you get guaranteed for free is going to be Dark Elhain. Dark Elhain is a champion that I wish I built a lot earlier. I do have her built out now, but I don't use her just because I do have better options. That's not to say she's not a fantastic champion, of course. It's just I have legendaries and, those sorts of things that can do her role a little bit better. As you can see, though, everybody quite likes her for pretty much everywhere in the game. She has an A1, destroying the target's max HP. She has an A2 that increases her own attack, so she's self-buffing, then attacks all enemies, and has a 75% chance of placing a decreased speed. So this is already a pretty decent kit, right? This is on a 3-turn cooldown, 75% chance of a debuff. What more does she have? Well, she also has a passive where she fills her turn meter by 25% and instantly activates her A2 whenever this champion or an ally receives a freeze. And she has another passive where it instantly removes any freezes from her and replaces them with increased crit rate, increased crit damage, and strengthen whenever an enemy places a freeze on this champion. So let's think about this utilization, this use case, right? If you're going against somebody in the arena who's using a Torment, boom, you instantly have a fantastic counter in her because she's going to just essentially be popping these nukes every time you're getting a freeze. There is a cooldown on this, of course, by 1 turn, so she has to take a turn. And then, of course, later game, when you're going against the Frost Spider, either in Doom Tower or City of Centranos, she is going to be able to come in and pop those AoE nukes as well. In City of Centranos, if you're just on regular waves and somebody tries to freeze you, there you go, boom, you're going to have some AoE nukage coming in too. And she does do very decent damage. So for all intents and purposes, I think she is a decent upgrade to the regular just damage-based starter champions that you get inside the game. Another option that we'll talk about is going to be kind of a replacement for Kale to some extent. So that is actually going to be Fane. Now, Fane is still used every single day on my account, even with all the legendaries and mythicals and epics that I have +4, you know, fully awakened. She is still going to be used every single day in my clan boss team, as well as a lot of Sidious and Tronos content, as well as Skinwalkers content too. So she attacks one enemy 2 times, each hit having a 50% chance of stealing 5% of the target's turn meter. Again, already makes her very good for something like Fire Knight. A2, 100% chance of placing 2 5% poisons and a decreased attack. So she's bringing some damage, she's bringing some poisons, and she's bringing some survivability for your team. A3, 100% chance of decreased defense. Second hit has a chance of weaken, and the third hit heals her by 4% for every debuff on the target. So if you're stacking up debuffs on the clan boss, you can heal her all the way up to 40% of her max HP essentially, which is absolutely fantastic. She does have very decent multipliers as well. As you can see, people like her for most areas inside the game. She's not really an arena champion, of course. She's very much similar to a Zinogre Blade Master, but an epic version, if that makes sense. Or I guess rather, Zinogre is basically just a legendary version of Fane, because Fane is the OG that's been in the game forever. She's been a most wanted champion for me for quite some time, essentially since she was first added into the game. So it feels quite good to have her now, essentially, and use her consistently. And I did make a video on her at some point too, so make sure to check that out if you're a little undecided on if you want to build her or not. And then the last option that we're going to talk about here is actually going to be from the Banner Lords. And now this is one that people don't really talk about too much. Just before we get into it, if you're liking the content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and the like button. It certainly helps the channel to grow, and it definitely gives the support to, you know, show me that you like the content and you want to keep seeing it. So that being said, the champion that we're talking about is Lady Quillin. Now, if you look at Lady Quillin on Hell Hades, she has a 2.5 star rating. She doesn't seem that good. I do have experience with her, though, on a free-to-play account where she absolutely carried me, which was pretty crazy, and I'm probably going to do a guide on her at some point as well. So she has an A1, fills this champion's turn meter by 15% if it's critical. She has an A2 that attacks one enemy, places an extra hit if this attack is critical, fills the turn meters of all allies by 30% if this attack kills an enemy. Now this has like a 3.5 times multiplier, I believe, so this on a 2 times hitter is going to be like a 6.5 to a 7 times damage multiplier on a base attack of 1476 with a 101 base speed. That is fantastic for epic champions. Now, let's say you're using her inside the arena, of course. She goes in, absolutely smacks down, let's say, their Arbiter, right? Or one of their squishy champions. She's then also going to fill the turn meter of the rest of your team by 30%. Not only that, A3 attacks all enemies, placing an increased crit damage on all allies for 2 turns, and places the big version of increased attack if the attack is critical. So not only can she be a damage dealer for your team, she can also be a setup champion for another nuker to go inside your team as well, right? Bringing that increased attack and that increased crit damage. She looks fantastic. She's got a very unique look to her, right? Kind of like the blacksmith type thing going on here. Very, very cool champion. Highly recommend actually using her. I do think the 2.5 star rating for her on the Hell Hades website is ridiculously low. I do definitely think she has a little bit more utility than that, certainly. Now, moving on, we're going to be talking about a champion that I actually struggled to get for a long time, and that is going to be Coldheart. Coldheart is very well known because of her enemy max HP A3, where she's also decreasing the turn meter by 100%. Now, if you were like me, you were playing for probably about 2 years before you actually managed to pull one from a Void Shard, at which point you probably had alternative champions built anyways. I do still have her, though, of course, and I do actually have 2 Coldhearts built currently, so that really goes to show you, just how good she is. Now, what are some alternatives? Well, first of all, you can come over here to the Undead Hordes and you can look at somebody like Husk. Husk actually has an AoE, enemy max HP skill. So he is a little bit better there where he can do that AoE damage instead of just single target. Now, Husk doesn't offer the turn meter control that Coldheart is bringing. However, he does offer a provoke chance on the A1, and then he does also have a fairly decent hit on the A3 as well. So Husk is certainly an option that you can make use of. Another option that I think more people are probably going to lean towards is actually going to be Royal Guard from the High Elves faction. So Royal Guard is a very well-known champion. A1, decreased defense chance. A2 is an AoE, enemy max HP nuke. And then his A3 has a decreased speed as well as a decreased turn meter, which is absolutely fantastic. So if you get lucky, you can get 100% turn meter decrease on this too, which is fantastic. So it's essentially a Coldheart skill. And then of course you have the AoE max HP as well, which is fantastic. If you have multiple copies of Royal Guard, I'd say you're probably good to go ahead and either empower him or start to use him, of course, somewhere like Hydra as well, and you can have multiple teams built out with him. He is such a strong champion. As you can see, everybody likes him for pretty much everywhere inside the game, which is quite fitting. He very much deserves it. Now, lastly, we are going back into the High Elves, I believe, and we are talking about Reliquary Tender, or if you're a little bit newer into the game, you might have picked yourself up a Tree Shield Knot as well. So I have made a video about this guy. I do think he's an absolutely fantastic champion. You don't necessarily need to replace him. I think his base stats are good enough to carry you into the mid game without an issue whatsoever. And he does also bring, you know, decreased attack, increased defense for your team, all that sort of good stuff, as well as shields, heals, and revives. He's absolutely fantastic, and I do think he deserves a lot of love because he is so good. That being said, though, if you're wanting to upgrade your revivers or your healers, who are you going with? Well, the first champion that we're going to talk about, if you manage to get her, congratulations, you just got the best epic reviver in the game. That is going to be Ursala the Mourner. Why is she so good? She has an A3, revives everybody with 75 HP, 75% HP rather, fills their turn meters by 50%, and places an increased defense and a strengthen on all allies for 3 turns. That'll happen anyways, so she can buff your team even if nobody's dead. She also has an AoE increased attack as well as decreased attack on the enemies, and then a turn meter decrease on the A1. Ursala is absolutely fantastic. She can hard carry you pretty much everywhere inside the game. The only real downside to her is her base stat. She's very low on the HP as well as the defense. She does have decent base HP though. And the other downside is she doesn't bring heals for your team, right? So there's no continuous heal or anything like that, just a revive. So if you're looking for heals, you're actually going to be bringing yourself over to the Knights Revenant, and you're going to be looking no further than Rector Droth. So Rector Droth has a heals all allies on the A2. After healing, she places a perfect veil on everybody with full HP and a continuous heal for 1 turn, instead on all allies with less than 100% HP rather. So this is actually very good. And why is that? If you think about it, in most cases, the heal of 20% is going to be enough to get them back to full, especially considering it's based off her HP. She's almost 110 base speed, only 17k base HP, which isn't the best, but she does have almost 1150 defense, which is insane. And then the champions that are not at full after that 20% heal are probably going to be your tank champions and the ones that have been soaking up all the hits. So realistically, you don't want your tanks to be veiled anyways, because if everybody else is veiled, it means the only champion getting targeted is your tank. So she is very strong. She does have a decreased attack on the A1 as well. And then she does actually have a revive with 60% HP and 60% turn meter, and a perfect veil for 3 turns on a 4-turn cooldown, so a very solid revive. And it gets better still because she has a mechanic on her passive that whenever an ally under a veil or perfect veil gets a turn, she heals them by 10% of their max HP. Also increases the resistance of allies under veil or perfect veil by 50. And on top of that, she has a resistance aura in Doom Tower battles by 55. So I remember when I first started inside the game, don't mind my storage notification there. I remember when I first started inside the game, I used her a ton to progress through Doom Tower, essentially just because of the, the resistances and all that sort of stuff. She came in so clutch. So those are essentially the champions that you can look to replace your starters with, your starting rares specifically. I hope this gives you guys some food for thought, and maybe gives you a path forward as well, right? Especially if you're a bit of a newer player. If you are, and this is your first raid content you're consuming, well, welcome to the channel. I have lots of videos out there. Feel free to kind of peruse and see if there's anything you like. Also, let me know down in the comments if there's any other video ideas you guys have, champions you'd like to see reviews of, all that sort of good stuff. And as always, I'll see you in the next video.